What happens when a professor tries to publicly humiliate a quiet student, unaware that she's challenging none other than Keanu Reeves? What began as an attempt to embarrass him turned into Allison no one at that university would ever forget. And by the end of this story, you'll see Keanu Reeves in a way you never expected. Oh, and before we continue, tell us, where are you watching this from? We love reading your comments. The sunlight filtered timidly through the tall windows of the old neoclassical building. It was the first day of the semester at Hartsfield University, an institution where the corridors carried the weight of tradition and the echoes of brilliant minds. Long gone students from across the country moved through the halls, still adjusting to the change in pace, the unfamiliar faces, and the pressure to keep up with the fierce rhythm of that prestigious institution. In room 204 of the Department of Pure Mathematics, seats were slowly filling up. Murmurs, nervous laughter, and quiet anticipation hung in the air at the center of the blackboard, written in crisp white chalk. It read, Advanced Calculus 1. Dr. Eleanor Voss. She was known for her academic rigor, her intellect sharp as a scalpel, and her absolute intolerance for mediocrity. To her, a classroom was not a place of comfort, but a battlefield where only the deserving survived. Mistakes didn't go unnoticed. Praise was never handed out lightly. Then quietly the door opened. Almost no one noticed. A man stepped in, drawing no attention to himself. He wore dark jeans and a plain black shirt, slightly tousled hair, sunglasses which he removed slowly, revealing focused eyes. He walked silently to the back of the room and took a seat. He looked older than the other students, carried a thick, worn-out black notebook. No laptop, no phone in sight. It was Keanu Reeves. A few students recognized him. There were some exchanged glances of surprise, but they respected his space. No whispering frenzy, just silent curiosity. What was he doing? Here was this for a film, a documentary. Arrel he was preparing for, but most of all, why did he look so genuinely interested? Before they could speculate, the door slammed shut, firm and final. Eleanor Voss entered with the presence of a commander stepping onto the field. She wore a tailored, charcoal gray suit, flawless. Her heels clicked softly against the wooden floor. She walked to the front, turned to face the class, and for a moment just stared at them. Here, yes, scanned the room like a scanner, slicing through layers of pretense. Welcome to reality, she said at last, her voice firm and cold. This is advanced calculus, and there's no room here for excuses, intellectual laziness, or empty arrogance. A heavy silence settled at this university. Meritocracy is our compass. I don't care if your father is a billionaire, if you came from a broken public school, or if you have millions of followers online. What matters here is what your mind can do with what you've learned. She paused, locking eyes with a student in the front row who quickly looked down. Or what you're about to learn. Keanu sat silently, showing no reaction. His eyes fixed on her, not in defiance, but with the kind of quiet intensity that absorbs and analyzes. Some of you think fame can replace effort. She continued, this time glancing toward the back of the room, that the glow of cameras makes up for the lack of discipline. But in this classroom there are no shortcuts. You stay if you prove you belong. The provocation was clear, carefully aimed. But Keanu didn't flinch, not a word, not a change in expression. He calmly turned the page of his notebook, as if the speech wasn't about him, or as if he'd heard it all before in different form with different voices. Minutes passed, the lecture moved forward, but something was different in the air. Attention not born from complex content, but from a game of unspoken rules. A game of authority, of silence, of hidden brilliance. At the end of class, as students gathered their things, still processing the weight of her presence, Keanu remained seated, finishing a line in his notebook. Then he stood calmly, walking toward the door with a quiet, almost invisible presence. And that's when she looked straight at him for the first time. Their eyes truly met. For a brief, charged second, they stood there, two worlds colliding. She, the embodiment of control, he, the living mystery. And what no one knew was that the quiet man sitting in the back of the room was about to change not just that class, but everyone's idea of what true knowledge really looks like. The next class came faster than anyone expected. Some students arrived early, as if something unspoken had been set in motion. After that first encounter, the atmosphere wasn't just about calculus anymore. It was about witnessing something unfold, something unusual. Keanu arrived minutes before the class started again. He walked in quietly, notebook in hand, and took his place in the last row. This time, more students noticed a few, whispered to each other. One dared to glance back and then elbowed her friend. He's back. He sat down, slowly crossed one leg over the other, and opened his notebook. Same seat, same. Calm Dr. Eleanor Voss entered right on time. Never early, never late. Let's not waste time, she said sharply. I've reviewed your diagnostic exercises. Most of you need to understand something very basic. Memorizing formulas won't save you. You either understand math or you're just pretending to. Her tone was sharper than the day before, like a blade being polished with each word instead of diving into the day's theory she veered off. We live in a time where everyone thinks they have something important to say, that opinions are as valid as facts, that posting quotes online is the same as understanding the science behind them. She walks slowly across the room. Mathematics doesn't care how famous you are, doesn't care how many movies you've made, doesn't care how adored you are. Outside these walls, she didn't say his name. She didn't need to. Then something unexpected happened. A hand rose in the back of the room. Keanu, calm, polite, almost reluctant. The room went still. Voss turned to him slowly, her face unreadable. Yes, he waited a second before speaking. His voice was calm, almost too soft but clear. I was just wondering why we're avoiding the actual content of the class. You said this course was about understanding mathematics, not ideology. The room held its breath. She smiled, but it wasn't kindness. It was the smile of someone preparing a verbal strike. And what exactly qualifies you to question how I conduct my class? Mr. Reeves, your resume in Hollywood, your experience dodging bullets in slow motion. The class chuckled nervously. Some lowered their eyes. The moment stung, but Keanu didn't flinch. No, not that. I just believe mathematics isn't about opinion. It's a tool to describe the world as it is, to decode patterns we don't even realize are there. The tone in the room shifted. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it, measured, precise, like someone used to silence, but whose words carried weight. When finally spoken, a student near the front whispered to herself, that didn't sound like an actor. Dr. Voss stood still. Interesting, she said, voice flat. But mathematics is more than pretty words. Mr. Reeves agreed. He said simply. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged. Something invisible but undeniable had changed. Some students began to look at Keanu differently. He wasn't just the actor. He was something else, something harder to define, and Dr. Voss felt it too. For the first time in a long while, she had been challenged, not by arrogance but by calm reason, not by someone trying to impress, but by someone who didn't seem to care if he did or not. She cleared her throat, returning to the board. Let's get back to it, she said. But her tone had changed. It was colder now, sharper, not because of what he said, but because of how unshaken he remained. She flew through examples, definitions, graphs, her voice slightly faster than usual. Keanu followed, insolence, taking notes. Writing not just what she said, but small derivations in the margins, as if preemptively exploring alternate paths she hadn't mentioned yet. As class neared its end, students were struggling to keep up. One student looked lost, another already closing her notebook, overwhelmed. Keanu, still silent, had pages full of notes, not just answers, ideas. When the bell rang, the air felt dense with unfinished tension. Dr. Voss gathered her things quickly, but before leaving, she turned around and said, some people believe silence is a virtue, that staying quiet makes you wise, but sometimes silence is just the mask of ignorance. She looked directly at Keanu, and for the first time, something flickered in his expression. Not anger, not offense, but something deeper, a quiet warning. The following class didn't feel like just another lecture. There was electricity in the air, the kind that precedes a storm. Students arrived early again, but this time the atmosphere was heavier. Everyone had felt the shift, the glances, the subtle stars toward the back of the room. They weren't about fame anymore. They were about curiosity, about a challenge. Unspoken, button-folding Keanu entered right before the hour, quiet as always, same seat, same black notebook. But this time, Drelelinor Voss was already in the room, standing by the chalkboard. Her arms crossed, she didn't greet the class, didn't ask them to open their books. Instead, she turned to the board and began writing not words but numbers, symbols, functions, fractions, notations that quickly spiraled into something dense, complex, intimidating by the time. She stepped back. The entire blackboard was filled with what looked like a monstrous equation. It wasn't from any textbook. Some students immediately looked lost. Others tried to transcribe it into their notebooks, confused. Keanu simply watched, eyes fixed on the board, hands resting on the table. Then came her voice, cold, surgical. This is the type of problem that filters mathematicians from hobbyists. It's not in your books, it's not in your lectures, it's not even in your exam prep guides. She turned to the class, but her eyes landed squarely on Keanu. So tell me, would anyone here like to try silence? She let the moment stretch. No one, how disappointing. And then, like a chess master revealing her trap, she added, Mr. Reeves, perhaps you'd like to take a shot since you seem to have such insight. The room stopped breathing. Some students turned around to look at him almost instinctively. Keanu didn't react. At first, he looked at the board, again studied it with the patience of someone not intimidated by complexity, but interested in it. Then slowly, he closed his notebook, he stood up and began walking toward the front of the room. A few gasps, someone whispered, "He's actually going." He didn't look at anyone, just walked like a man walking towards something inevitable. Not dramatic, not flashy, just necessary. When he reached the board, he stood in front of it, not touching the chalk yet, just reading, tracing the logic, following the threads. Beneath the surface of the expression, Dr. Voss took a step back, arms crossed, watching with the confidence of someone sure they've just staged a masterclass in humiliation. The class was completely silent. Keanu reached for a piece of chalk, looked at it for a second, then began. But he didn't go straight to the middle of the equation. He started at the corner of the board and began writing. Context. This seems like a nested limit problem disguised with a differential topology twist, he said softly. Not to show off, but to explain. The students leaned in. He wrote slowly, step by step, explaining as he went. You've built a false contradiction into the structure. Here he circled a section. If you isolate this inner term and treat it as a converging function rather than a discrete value. He continued line by line. He unraveled the trap. His handwriting was neat, confident, like someone who had done this 1,000 times. Not just to solve problems, but to teach others how to see. He connected the logic to Ghiberto Ramanujan, even referencing Noether's theorem in passing. What we're really looking at here isn't about solving 4x. It's about understanding why the limit doesn't exist unless you shift the dimensional context. Students were staring now, not at the board, at him, at how easily he danced through concepts that most of them struggled to even pronounce. Dr. Voss didn't say a word. One student, a quiet girl who never spoke, raised her hand, almost shyly. I think I finally get what a limit actually is like for real. Keanu turned to her, smiled gently. That's the point. Math isn't about memorizing steps, it's about seeing patterns. Feeling when something's wrong or beautiful. That word hung in the air. Beautiful, used in a math class, and somehow it made perfect sense. He turned back to the board and without drama finished the last step. The solution glowed like a revelation. Not because it was flashy, but because it made sense. He stepped aside. The class broke into scattered claps, then louder. Then almost applause, and yet Keanu didn't bow, didn't smile broadly. As simply handed the chalk back to Dr. Voss, who hadn't moved. Her face was unreadable. Cold, but her eyes betrayed something that hadn't been there before. Uncertainty for the first time. Her authority had been challenged, not by rebellion, but by undeniable mastery. She didn't say thank you, didn't offer a comment. She simply turned to the board and erased the entire solution. Insolence. The chalk dust fell like ash. Keanu returned to his seat, quiet, composed, but something had shifted forever. No one in that room expected him to not only accept the challenge, but to turn that equation into a lesson they would never forget. The next lecture didn't feel like just another class. It felt like a sequel. whispers had turned into quiet expectation. Students who barely stayed awake during lectures now arrived early, notebooks open, eyes sharp, and when Keanu Reeves walked in, calm, low-key, same notebook tucked under his arm, there was a hush of something like respect. He took a seat at the back, as usual. No fanfare, just presence. The door opened. Dr. Eleanor Voss walked in with her usual poise, but her expression was tight. Controlled her steps a little. Sharper, she placed her materials down without a word and began writing immediately. No warm-up, no recap. Today we move to vector-valued functions and partial derivatives. She said, her tone flat, clipped. This isn't high school calculus. If you're not prepared, you'll fall behind. The warning wasn't subtle. Then in the middle of her explanation, she stopped, turned slowly to the back of the room. Mr. Reeves, she said, since you've contributed so much, perhaps you'd like to walk us through the gradient of a scalar field. There it was, another challenge, but this time Keanu didn't hesitate. He stood, walked to the front, and picked up the chalk without drama, just calm intention. He looked at the board for a second, then began think of the gradient not just as direction, he said, writing a clean vector diagram, but as the path nature would take if it could move freely, like gravity or heat. The gradient tells you which way forward, really. As the class leaned in, his voice was calm but magnetic. He didn't just explain. Translated complexity into clarity. He connected the gradient to real-world forces, mountain slopes, pressure systems, thermodynamics. When you're climbing, the gradient tells you which way is hardest, and also which way takes you to the peak fastest. One student whispered, "Why does that make so much sense?" Another followed, "I've never heard it like that." Keanu kept going, drawing connections, inviting students to visualize the math feel. Even he never once looked to impress, and yet every eye was fixed on him. Then a quiet voice spoke, I think I finally get it." It came from a girl in the front row, one of the quietest in class. Keanu turned, smiled gently. "That's what matters, understanding, not perfection." Dr. Voss stood beside him, unmoving, watching. She had spent years commanding this room, owning the space, with sharp intellect and sharper expectations. Now it was his, and worse, he didn't seem to want it. He handed her the chalk without ceremony and returned to his seat. She stared at the board for a long second, then began erasing High's explanation without comment. The dust fell quietly. She resumed her lesson, but something had shifted. Her words moved faster, less deliberate. Students looked back toward Keanu, as if waiting for another translation. The magic was gone. Class ended early when she left. Her steps were fast, controlled, but her silence spoke volumes. As students gathered their things, one approached Keanu. "Do you tutor?" she asked almost nervously. He blinked, surprised, then nodded. "After class works, I'll stay a bit if anyone wants help." A few more students hovered nearby, unsure, then joined a group, began forming, not around fame, around someone who made them feel smart, capable, seen. And Keanu, he offered his time without expectation, not to sheen, just to help, because for him this was never about taking the spotlight. It was about sharing something that had always been his, now quietly becoming theirs too. And that moment would mark the beginning of a transformation, far greater than any of them expected, including Keanu himself. Room 204 was full. Before the hour struck, whispers had faded. Now it was silence, the kind that arrives before something important. Keanu Reeves was there as always, in the back, notebook open, calm posture. But the eyes were on him for the first time, not because of fame. Dr. Eleanor Voss entered, right on time, impeccable posture, controlled expression, but something in her eyes was at war. She went straight to the point, writing a dense equation on the board, but in the middle of her explanation, she stopped, turned. "Mr. Reeves," she said with a controlled voice, "you seem to enjoy being the center of attention." The room froze. Keanu looked at her. No defensive reaction, just calm. "I'm just here to help," he replied. She took a step forward. "You're not faculty, you're not even a real student in this course, so tell me, why are you really here?" The accusation had been made. Keanu closed his notebook calmly. "Because I love math," he said, "and because I believe anyone can understand it if someone's willing to teach." Some students exchanged glances. That was more than just an answer. It was a mirror, but Voss didn't back down. Or maybe this is just your new stage, a role you're playing, the genius among commoners." He stood up. "Not in confrontation, but with dignity. You challenged me publicly," I responded, and students understood. "Isn't that the point of teaching silence?" The door opened. The university dean walked in, the air grew. "Have you heard this class has become dynamic?" he said with a slight smile. "Mind if I watched?" Dr. Voss nodded stiffly. The class continued, but the tension remained until Keanu raised his hand. "Would you allow me to present a second method for this problem side by side with yours, Nato? Compete." Just to clarify, the proposal was clear and fair, but it was also an invitation to vulnerability. She hesitated, looked at the board, at the students, at the dean, and said, "Now this is my class. I don't share my board with outsiders." The murmuring was immediate, not of surprise, but of quiet disappointment. Keanu took a deep breath. "With respect, Professor, you challenged me in front of everyone, and now you're walking away from the same challenge." She turned. "Are you accusing me of cowardice? I'm saying how we lead is how we're remembered." The phrase hung in the air like an unresolved equation. The dean watched her, saying nothing, because in that instant, everyone knew the next choice would reveal who she truly was, and what she decided in that moment would expose not just her teaching, but her very character. The room was frozen. All eyes were on Dr. Voss. She gripped the chalk like it was the last thing she still controlled. The dean stood silently near the door, watching everything, saying nothing. Then her voice broke the silence. "Enough," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I won't be humiliated in my own classroom." Keanu stood. No anger, no challenge, just calm. "No one's trying to humiliate you," he said gently. "We just want to learn. Isn't that what this room is for?" She stared at him. Her expression held anger, but beneath it, fear. Keanu walked toward the board slowly, respectfully. He reached out his hand after a long pause. She handed him the chalk. He turned to the class. "Let me show you the same problem, but in a way you can see it, not just calculate it." And then he began. He used colors, simple shapes, visuals. He explained how the function moved, how it breathed like the arc of a leaf falling through the air, or a car gaining speed down a hill. Students learned in eyes wide, heads nodding. "Math isn't about ego," he continued. "It's a language. If someone doesn't understand, maybe we're not speaking it the right way yet." People began clapping, not politely, but genuinely. The energy shifted. More students filtered in through the open door, drawn by the buzz. Some sat on the floor. Others stood along the walls, watching. Insolence. Keanu wrote the final step, simple, clear. Then he turned back to the class. "Knowledge should never be used to measure who's better. It should be a bridge so we can cross together." For a moment, silence, then applause. Real loud, emotional, the kind that comes not from performance but from gratitude. Dr. Voss stood still, and though she didn't move, something inside her had. She was no longer just a teacher in that room, she was a witness. Keanu walked back to his seat in the last row as if nothing had happened. And yet everything had. The video of that class would spread across the university. And what happened in the days to come would create a legacy no one saw coming. Days passed. But room 204 hadn't been the same since the video of Keanu's lesson, filmed quietly by a student in the second row, had gone viral inside the campus within hours. Not because of who he was, but because of what he did. It wasn't just about solving a problem. It was about making people feel capable again. The next lecture arrived with quiet tension. No one knew if Dr. Voss would even show up. She did, but something in her was different. Her posture was still upright, her voice still steady. But her eyes, they no longer scanned the room like a battlefield. She stood at the front for a long moment, then took a breath. "Before we begin," she said, slowly, "I want to acknowledge what happened last class." Everyone went silent. "I made mistakes. I let pride get in the way of purpose, and I lost sight of what this classroom is really for." Yes widened. Some students glanced at each other. "Mr. Reeves," she looked toward the back. "I want to thank you." Keanu nodded. Humble as always, she stepped aside. "Would you consider collaborating with me on future lessons? I believe there's something powerful in combining theory with the clarity you bring." The room was stunned. Keanu stood. "Only if we do it together," he said. "Not teacher and guest, just two people who care about understanding." Though she smiled, genuine. From that day on, something shifted, their dynamic evolved. She taught the core theory, but allowed space for interpretation, examples, and storytelling. Keanu didn't dominate. He filled in the blanks. Students who had once failed began to thrive. Questions came more freely. Confidence grew. The university took notice. Soon other departments began revisiting their teaching models. The Math department updated part of its curriculum, integrating practical visualization, collaborative feedback, and student-led sessions. And Keanu, he never moved from the back row. He was never listed on faculty, never asked to be, but he showed up every class. And when a student struggled, he'd sit beside them, quietly, patiently, helping them see the shapes behind the numbers. One afternoon, a freshman lingered after class. "Why do you sit back there?" she asked. Keanu smiled. "Because from the back you can see who needs help the most." Final line. Because in the end, the real privilege isn't knowing more than others. It's using what you know so that everyone can reach.